is our timeline, and you can see that it was mostly Republican throughout the whole thing. The last, like, 3 Republicans were the most influential.
Yeah, by the way, the introduction, they're going to talk about politics, which is, you're going to see a trend here, so pay attention to this. And it will kind of bring together a lot of what's been talked about.
All right, so the Gilded Age. The different parties, so Republican and Democrats, had a lot of differences. So their loyalties were guided by region and religious and ethnic differences rather than focusing on the overall people. They were all pro-businesses, so both parties were supportive of economic radicalism and reform. Both parties opposed of sound currency, which is a good thing. Both parties advocated and supported the status quo in the present financial system. And the federal government and state government had very little involvement. And during the Gilded Age, the Senate was dominated by the Republicans, and the House of Representatives was dominated by the Democrats. And the Republican Party was then split into a couple different groups of the stalwarts, half-breeds, and Muslims.
The Progressive Era reform in 1901 was the response of the people to the corporate abuses and corruption, like we'll see with Tammany Hall later. Religious groups, press, and radical political groups supported the reform. Theodore Roosevelt supported the movement with the mindset of improving his country.
Mining and industry. So the dramatic increase of mining and growth of industry caused several changes in the country's way of life, which resulted in the political and governmental change and involvement. The American Federation of Labor was also known as Congress of Industrial Organizations, was developed and led by Samuel Gompers. In 1849, the size of a mining claim was then reduced to what a man could mine by himself, and this was also the time when this also outlawed slavery. Metal mining was then still governed by laws which were enacted in 1866 and 1872. This law is a national law regulated by the U.S. government, Department of the Interior Bureau of Land Management. It gives the U.S. citizen the opportunity to freely search for, discover, and buy certain valuable mining mineral deposits without a permit on federal lands that remains open for that purpose. This law sets general standards and guidelines for claiming the possessory rights for valuable minerals discovered during exploration. The General Mining Act was then made in 1872, which is a federal law that authorizes and manages prospecting and mining for economic minerals such as gold, silver, or platinum. And this helped protect mining claims on public land. Yep, and so this is a picture of mining during the 1860s and 1870s.
All right, so we have McKinley and Roosevelt. Roosevelt was definitely influential for his turn in that business. Let's get right to it. So we have McKinley was elected in 1897 as a Republican, same as Roosevelt in 1901. During McKinley's election, the nation was mostly Democratic supporting. During Roosevelt's election, the nation was primarily Republican, apart from the South, which remained Democratic. Before the election, the 54th Congress had about even Republican and Democratic seats. After the election, there was a majority of seats that were Republican. When Roosevelt was president, the Congress majority was Republican as well.
So, agriculture. With the use of new technology and machinery, farmers then increased production, and the railroad provided transportation of goods across the country. In 1867, farmers founded the National Grange, which is an organization for farmers to share knowledge of new farming technology. The Grange was a non-partisan organization, which means it's not focused on any certain party in the government. And they used their political power to negotiate better terms with the railroads. From 1870s to the 80s, farmers' alliances were formed by the Populist Party and organized to reduce the overhead of transporting agricultural products across the nation. It provided free coinage of silver, governmental ownership of railroads, telegraphs, and telephone lines, graduated income tax, and direct election of U.S. senators. In 1891, the Populist Party, which is a third-party movement that sprang up in the 1890s and drew up support especially from disgruntled farmers, and it called upon the government to assist the farmers and support the new reform.
Paul, you want to go back? I think what Paul just said is so critically important when we look at the setup for the 20th century. So back at the beginning, when you were listing what the Farmers Alliances supported, so let's be really clear. So would you I just think it bears repeating. You gave a lot of really good information there. And this is our setup for the 20th century. So what were the issues that the Farmers Alliances supported? And the Farmers Alliance grew into the Populist Party. So I just think it bears repeating because this is important stuff. Go ahead, Paul.
Okay, so just the Farmers Alliance, or do you want the grain? Okay.
Well, you had that nice list of issues they were supporting.
Okay. Let's see. So farmers founded the National Grange, which is an organization, like I said, for farmers to share knowledge of new farming technology. The Grange were nonpartisan organizations which used their political power to negotiate better terms with the railroads, so better transportation of goods and things like that. Farmers Alliance, formed by the Populist Party, organized to reduce the overhead of transporting agricultural products across the nation. So, like I said, better transporting of goods, which was their main cause. So free coinage of silver, governmental ownership of railroads, telegraphs, and telephone lines, graduated income tax, direct election of U.S. senators.
Everybody get that? Income tax, direct election of senators, government ownership of railroads, free tonnage for silver. But I just want to, so I'm telling you to make note of that, because when we look at 20th century and the populist, so we now have a populist party, political party. Did you tell us who headed that up? The
Populist Party?
Yeah. Were there any leaders?
I do not have this.
Okay, all right. Sorry to interrupt, but what they just said
Tom
was,
Watson?
what?
Alright, so immigration and race relations. So in the election of 1860, so Democrats split at its 1860 convention when a platform for defending slavery was defeated, and Deep South delegates walked out. Stephen Douglas of Illinois was nominated as president candidate on a platform opposing any congressional interference with slavery. Southern delegates met and nominated John Breckinridge of Kentucky as a candidate on a pro-slavery platform. Then the Republicans opposed slavery and drew in Northern support with a platform supporting a Homestead Act, a protective tariff, and transporting changes. The platform opposed slavery but defended the right of states to control their own domestic institutions. Abraham Lincoln was then nominated as a presidential candidate for the Republicans. Immigration. So, 1876, Congress developed a joint commission to investigate the Chinese immigration, the 15-passenger bill, which was created, which prevented no more than 15 immigrants on a vessel. 1880s to 1881, the U.S. was given the right to regulate, limit, or suspend the coming of residents of Chinese laborers. In 1882, Chinese Immigration Act prevented more Chinese immigrants from entering the country. 1892, the Gary Act required all Chinese immigrants to provide certification of residency. 1892 to 1905, the Japanese immigration was getting the attention of the government. And in 1894, the Immigration League sought to require literacy testing to all immigrants. So here you can see, so this is a graph of all the immigrants coming to the United States from 1820 to 2006. And this is the number of immigrants through 1861 to 1890. And if you come down here to China, a dramatic increase from, let's see, 1861 to 1880. And then when the certain restrictions came about on the Chinese regarding their immigration over here, this is what they had a significant dip. You can also see from 123,201 to 91,711. Industry and business. So railroads, mining, and agricultural industries add significant financial gains to the U.S. economy. The U.S. became the world's leading industrial nation during this time period. Early years of the Industrial Revolution, the government maintained a hands-off attitude towards businesses, meaning that the government was told to lay off other businesses. 1879, the Joint Executive Committee was developed to govern the industrial monopoly that was occurring due to the iron industry, steel production, oil drilling, and meat. 1885 to 1905, large life insurance companies expanded dramatically and became deeply involved in political and governmental legislation. 1887, Interstate Commerce Act was devised to stop the railroads from price discrimination. The Sherman and Trust Act outlawed trusts and any other contracts that prevented free trade throughout the United States.
So lots of labor acts were enacted by the progressive reformers. They responded to the industrial Americans' bad working conditions. So the Pullman strike occurred because of the horrible way that George Pullman, who was the president of this car company, treated his workers. The first Wildcat strike was without permission from the workers' union, and most of the workers were part of the American Railroad Union. When over 50 workers eventually quit, the railroads needed help from the federal troops. Federal troops could only be sent with the president's approval, and President Cleveland said he would only send government troops if that governor would request them. So the workers' compensation laws enacted by the progressive reformers. These laws gave compensation to injured workers as long as it was proven that it was not their fault. And the large factories were trying to avoid liability, so they would. That's when that came about. Muckrakers. They were these really cool people who produced writings and pictures and cartoons of things exploiting corruption and bad parts of the government. So we have them describe the action that was not actually seen. In the Pullman strike, these are all the people going on strike. Politics. Corruption. After the Civil War, there was a widespread corruption with the officials using government positions for personal gain, like Tammany Hall. Reformers won control in many cities and states by electing people to Congress who supported their views. Also supported the poor by developing laws to inspect tenement housing and improving life in poor areas, providing areas where children can play. The Populist People's Party was the third party movement that came around in the 1890s and drew support from mainly farmers. Formed by farmers who were angry against the Democratic and Republican parties for ignoring their needs and difficulties, they called upon the federal government to buffer economic depressions, regulate banks, and help suffering farmers. The party elected several members to Congress, governors, and legislators in the Midwest.
You want to explain the cartoon there, because
Yeah.
I can't really read it.
So this was a cartoon. Well, this is Thomas E. Watson. and he was the head of the People's Party
Yeah, so that looks like actually a political campaign poster,
Yeah.
doesn't it? Yeah.
for president of Georgia. And then the last thorn of summer, they're clipping off the head of the last Tammany Hall, or like the winner of
okay.
Tammany Hall, who was Tweed something. Yeah.
Yeah, Boss Tweed. So what's that? So that's, so the scissors, what's the word on the scissors?
Where?
Reform.
Says
Reform? Okay.
Yeah.
And
And
what's,
they're
what's
cutting
the,
off the heads of like, it's like a thorn bush. It's like the last thorn of summer, so they're cutting off the head of the head guy. It's when they finally, I don't know, infiltrated the Tweed circle, which was like the circle of, corruption. He went to jail. So we have, these are really influential people in this time. So Jane Addams was a feminist who was a big influence in women's suffrage. Jacob Riis was a social reformer and a muckraker. And then Tom Watson led populist revolt against Democrats. And then President Theodore Roosevelt. Tammany Hall, the muckrakers were members of press that majorly investigated corruption, like I said, in the country to expose them to American citizens. They were very influential and passed many laws reforming abuse they reported. Thomas Nast worked on political cartoons. He worked to expose the abuses of the NYC political machine called Tammany Hall through cartoon usage. Tammany Hall was an NYC political organization formed in 1789 in opposition to the Federalist Party. It originally stemmed from a wish to help the poor and immigrant population, but it became infamous for its charges of corruption. So here we have Tammany Hall, and that's Boss Tweed in a cartoon that Thomas Nast drew, and it said, "That's what's the matter, Boss Tweed. As long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it? Say, in counting there is strength." So, just kind of watching that. So, the Whig Party was involved with railroads, and they supported and helped fund the turnpikes and railroads. The Democrats supported the state-funded and created internal improvements. Lincoln's party, the Republican Party, supported the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. He signed the Pacific Railroad Bill that put federal government behind the project. The Interstate Commerce Act made railroads the first industry to subject to federal regulation. Congress passed the law in response to public demand that the railroad be regulated. And you've seen that picture before with the Indian policy. In 1870, Rutherford Hayes, president at the time, strongly supported the assimilation of Indians into mainstream America. He stressed educational training and their goal to make Indians loyal and patriotic laborers. Indian reservations were eventually broke up into pieces of land that could be owned by the more wealthy. The Indian Appropriations Act, Congress approved, which made them individuals and legally designated wards of the federal government. The Dawes Act, the government decided that instead of taking the Indians out of white society, Indians should be molded into white society. This is the new federal role, like Rutherford Hayes wanted. But now Cleveland was president. He wanted to encourage the Native Americans to integrate into American culture. When he signed this, he was attempting to improve the lives of the Indians, but it forced them into desolate reservations where living was hard. We have the Indian land for sale. Get a home of your own. East Payments. Perfect title. Possession within 30 days, find lands in the West. And then you have another cartoon of the Dawes Act eating up Indians.
that's a great cartoon. Who drew that? Is that a Nash?
2012.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
someone recently doing historic.
So a little bit of continuity over there. Through conservation, the government tried new methods to public policy and was cited for changing the economy in regards to increasing an urban, industrial, and consumer-oriented culture. The presidency and Congress were both ruled by Republicans from 1821 to 1921 to 1933, and the position was pro-business. Conflicts still arose regarding discrimination, racial, ethnic, and male and female Political corruption, larger corporations and more political leverage, payoff of opponents occurred regularly beforehand, in the Gilded Era, there was a lot of corruption. Workers' compensation and safety, a constant strain to support the growing industries and meet the demands of the unions. And ethnic, culture, and religious division, the Republicans and Democrats were supported by different sectors, which caused clashes and threats, upheaval, and deep divisions amongst the voters.
Our sources, our picture sources.
Okay. Good.
I guess to wrap it up, the Gilded Era was all about not very good presidents and corruption. And then once Roosevelt and Taft in the end, back to our timeline, that's when a lot of the corruption got solved and a lot of things they really got down to work, so they were good presidents.
And that was during the Progressive Era.
So yeah.
All right. Good. So that's it we have for today, right?